Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear colleagues, dear students, welcome to WU Vienna, to our today's special event titled Closed to Exclusion, Open to Inclusion. As you know, WU is celebrating its 125th anniversary this year. Founded in 1898 as Imperial Export Academy, WU has quite some history. In 1898, the Secretary of Commerce issued a circular that was directed to the chambers of commerce and business in Austria. In this circular, he was basically complaining about the fact that many other countries were doing much better in international trade. And he explained the reasons that led to the foundation of the Export Academy, namely to offer an education corresponding to today's requirements. Although these statements referred to business and international trade, it was already mentioned, and now I quote, "The limitation of the horizon already damages commercial activity at home, but above all, it hinders the development of intensive work abroad." So from day one onwards, the purpose of this institution was to expand young people's horizons, to give them an education based on expertise and knowledge, and to make them fit for international relations. Today we ask ourselves, did we live up to that? In large parts, I would say yes. Much of our history we can certainly celebrate today. But there are parts of our history that we are not proud of, on which we look with pain and shame. History that is so inhuman, so brutal and cruel that it was completely negated for a long time, was kept secret, was taboo, and which to this day is almost trivializingly called dark times. In these dark times, under the regime of the Nazis, people were threatened, harassed, dispossessed, chased away, injured, betrayed, tortured, and murdered because of their origin, their beliefs, their sexuality, their political positions, or physical characteristics. People were murdered systematically and en masse in the most gruesome ways because of being Jewish. Taking on responsibility sometimes hurts. But being rector of this university means that my job encompasses more than just celebrating our successes. As an institution, we are responsible for the people who were victims of the worst crimes in our history, who we failed to protect. We also bear responsibility for the ones who we should have protected the victims from. The Nazis, who under this cloak of a dark time were allowed to receive the highest awards of the university. They and their followers can no longer expect the protection of comfortable silence. We understand that it is part of our institutional responsibility to thoroughly examine who was recipient of the honors of our university, to publicly address their crimes and wrongdoings, and to contextualize or revoke honorary degrees and titles if necessary. Today, 4 such cases will be presented by our historian, Dr. Johannes Koll. Not to give the perpetrators a stage, but to give our critical self-reflection a space, and to demonstrate that we are taking our institutional responsibility seriously. Actually, stage we will give today those who have been victims to the Nazi regime, to give visibility to those who suffered under National Socialism and all the crimes committed during these years, to all the people whose lives were destroyed. Today we want to give these victims back a place in our midst, the place that was brutally taken from them, to see those we want to commemorate, who we want to invite back into our midst as part of our community. Even if this return is not a triumphed one, not a victory, not a conclusion. We want to give them a place at this university in remembrance today, and also as part of our globe, which is located in the middle of this new campus view. Read and hear their names as reminder of their aspirations, intellect, ideas, and hopes. There should be no more silence or forgetting. Finally, today we also want to see clearly where we are today in the 125th anniversary of our founding in 2023. This beautiful campus, which also celebrates an anniversary as we moved here 10 years ago in 2013. This campus is located in the 2nd district of Vienna. If you ask about the state of anti-Semitism, I urge you to go visit our Jewish neighbors in this very district and ask them about their experiences today. And you will be probably shocked. As was published recently, 36% of the Austrians believe in anti-Semitic myths. So, sadly, anti-Semitism did not disappear. It still exists in various forms, in everyday life and also in the workplace. The limitation of the horizon, you remember, is not only damaging commercial activities, it not only hinders development abroad, as we have heard before. It is not only about business and trade. It is a true danger to peace and prosperity of all our people, of our health and safety, of our freedom and democracies. Therefore, it is our responsibility as university to reflect critically on our own role in the past. But it is also our responsibility to educate young people to become open-minded and to contribute to the prevention of exclusion and discrimination. Today's event is not an easy one, but by breaking the silence, we will grow. Thank you. Professor Koll, bitte.
Ladies and gentlemen, some time ago, the EU has initiated a research project to investigate the holders of academic honors with a National Socialist past. In the last few months, the task for my assistant Stephanie Lucas and I was to examine the 25 honorary doctors that were eligible for a questionable Nazi past. Through extensive research, we identified 7 honorary doctors who belonged to Nazi organizations or had acted in accordance with the ideological principles of National Socialism. Among them was Walter Kastner, who officially joined the Nazi Party in 1943. However, this lawyer was more than an ordinary party member. In fact, Walter Kastner served the Nazi regime as a high-ranking civil servant with dire consequences for a Jewish entrepreneur. After he had become a leading director of the Austrian Bank for Industry and Commerce, Kastner personally was responsible for the so-called Aryanization of about 100 Austrian enterprises. As you certainly know, the policy of Aryanization implied a systematic, state-sanctioned deprivation of potentially all Jews. Oddly enough, Aryanization, now in the way of restitution, remained Kastner's field of activity after the Second World War. He did so in various functions: as government advisor, again as high-ranking civil servant, and as a lawyer. In some cases, he helped those people he had been involved in robbing during the Nazi era to regain their property after 1945. Although Walter Kastner evidenced a strong involvement in the criminal policies of the Nazi regime, he was rewarded an honorary doctorate by WU in 1983. From today's perspective, this honor, now withdrawn, seems all the more astonishing given that Kastner's involvement in the Aryanization was far from being unknown at that time. Just on the contrary, in his autobiography, published in 1982, Kastner himself had bluntly exposed his contribution to Nazi politics, including the role he had played in the context of the Aryanization. Until the end of his life, he did not testify any expression of regret about his role in the Nazi regime. And as Walter Kastner has to be qualified as a perpetrator, WU has decided recently to withdraw his honorary doctorate. The biographies of 3 other honorary doctors are to be qualified on the whole as followers or sympathizers of the Nazi regime. This applies to Josef Hellerer, the very first honorary doctor. He joined several National Socialist organizations in the Third Reich, including an organization that supported the SS financially. Also, Karl Friedrich Rössle was a member of the NSDAP and a series of other Nazi organizations. During the Second World War, Rössle supported the Nazi regime not just as an officer of the German army. He also exposed himself as a scientist who had no reservations about research areas like regional planning that were clearly ideologically motivated in the Nazi period. Finally, Erich Eduard Koziol is to be found among the honorary doctors who had close links to the Nazi regime. While in the Weimar Republic, Koziol had been politically active in a democratic and pro-republican party, he smoothly switched to the NSDAP shortly after Adolf Hitler had seized power in Germany. In some other National Socialist organizations, he performed functionary activities. From the point of view of a responsible university like WU, it is necessary to critically contextualize the biographies of Hellerer, Rössle, and Koziol, and the awarding of honorary doctorates to former National Socialists. Relevant texts will be made available on the internet in the near future. From the point of a democratic, pluralistic university, it is also necessary to commemorate those university members who were persecuted by the Nazi regime. Their fates have been researched since 2012 as part of WU's commemorative project. This project resulted in the erection of the memorial on the campus designed by the artist Alexander Felsch and the commemorative book which presents the biographies of the persons concerned on the internet. When the memorial was opened solemnly in May 2014, it was clear that research into the history of National Socialist persecution had not been completed at that time. Thanks to continued research, 31 more university members who had also become victims of National Socialist persecution have been identified in the meantime. We especially remember them today when we celebrate the addition of their names to the memorial. What happened to these persons after the Anschluss of Austria to the German Reich had taken place in March 1938? Some of them were persecuted on account of their Jewish descent. Others because of their involvement in Austrofascism. Among the latter group was Hans Karl Cessna-Spitzenberg, who perished in the Dachau concentration camp in August 1938. Among the persons to be added to the memorial are 2 graduates who were deprived by the Nazi regime of the academic titles they had rightfully acquired at WU's predecessor, the University for World Trade, sometime before the Anschluss of Austria. This fate befell Josef Hillebrand and Leopold Weiss. Some of the 31 persons survived the Holocaust and the Second World War together with their families by immigrating to the United Kingdom, the United States of America, Palestine, or other relatively secure countries. Others, like for example Slama Blum, were able to emigrate and live to see the end of the war, but lost almost their entire family to the Holocaust. Fritz Rubicek, in turn, survived the Auschwitz death camp and the so-called death march to the Buchenwald concentration camp, but lost his first wife as well as his parents in the Holocaust. Other university members lost themselves their lives in the Holocaust. Among them were Professor Adolf Jolles and the Lithuanian student Braina Gerschatter. Their biographies are briefly presented to you immediately afterwards. Before I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to point out that university members in individual cases actively resisted the Nazi regime. Among the 31 persons added to the memorial, Halina Karin stands out in this respect. She succeeded in May 1942 in detonating a bomb in the immediate vicinity of the Warsaw headquarters of the Gestapo. Halina Karin thus enriches the small group of university members who stood up to the murderous Nazi regime by force of arms. This particular group also includes persons who had already been inscribed on the memorial in 2014. Please think about Professor Karl Meitner and to the so-called Ritchie boys, who were deployed by the US Army as specialists for interrogating captured German or Austrian soldiers or other functionaries of the Nazi regime in Europe. Taken together, WU and the University for World Trade included perpetrators, supporters, resistance fighters, and victims of National Socialist persecution. Through its research projects on problematic academic honors and the commemorative project, WU tries to shed light on the dark sides of its past. We owe this to the victims of Nazi persecution, whose life and suffering were almost unknown for too long. At the same time, the study of the dark sides of history helps us to identify undesirable developments in the past. This, in turn, can contribute to develop responses for the present and the future based on historical experience. This is all the more necessary as we are confronted with discrimination, persecution, wars, and state-sponsored mass murder again and again, despite the terrible experiences of the Nazi era. But where would we be without enlightenment about the aberrations of history? Thank you for your attention. As promised to you earlier, you will learn now a bit more on the students and professors of the University for World Trade who have been expelled from this university or discriminated in one form or other. For this purpose, the Vienna-based Austrian writer and journalist Eva Reisinger has written a text specially for this event. Therefore, I ask you to come to the forum now.
The power of remembering. We have all seen the images. We have learned the dates and facts in school. We have read books and watched films about the era. We know that we are supposed to remember. We know that we should remember. We know that we shall remember, but not now. Remembering is hard. It's difficult to cope with all the shame and repulsion about our country, what our country did, what our families did. So better let others do the work and deal with those things. What happened, happened. Remembering things is difficult for people in general. Forgetting is and remains the easy way, because forgetting happens naturally. Bit by bit, history keeps disappearing and all the names fade into oblivion. Bernhard Jagged. If he had never existed, as if Bernhard Jagged had never lived in the apartment at Nestroygasse 516a in Vienna's 2nd district, as if he had never fled to Palestine together with his family, as if Bernhard had never become Ben Zion. When dealing with the time of National Socialism, Austria has always tried to keep its distance, even though in reality there never was such a distance. Remembering means taking responsibility. We all carry it on our shoulders. The more we try to repress it, the stronger the repercussions. This whole country is one big omission mark. Journalist Barbara Kaufmann wrote in an essay about the myth of Austria as a victim of National Socialism. It seems that this myth has been passed down from generation to generation like an heirloom, along with the family tableware and savings book. There is this constant fear of being called out by people who are busy digging up the past, trying to point the finger and hold you accountable. This is what journalist Kaufmann calls paranoia austriaca. When you live in a constant fear, you don't want to drag the old stories out in the light. But the past won't go away, and the weight won't be lifted from our shoulders if we choose to remain ignorant. Hans Herbert Brunn was banned from University of World Trade in 1938 because of his Jewish ancestry, and he eventually fled to Italy. Everything was taken from his family. It's hard to acknowledge that a university, which once stood for open-mindedness and global spirit, ended up banning its faculty, expelling students from auditoriums, replacing teachers with Hitler supporters, and awarding titles and honorary doctorates to Nazis. Adolf Joles was a Jewish academic who taught at the University of World Trade and married his wife in his parents' apartment on Gloriettegasse in Vienna in the 13th district. Following Austria's so-called Anschluss to Nazi Germany, he was no longer allowed to teach at the university, and he was forced to adopt the name Israel and wear a yellow star. He and his wife were killed in Theresienstadt concentration camp in 1942. The university that would later become today's WU was not immune from all the hate and violence. Even in the time before the so-called Anschluss, Jewish students, faculty members faced discrimination, while Nazi supporters were busy spreading hate. One would believe that of all places, a University of World Trade should be the home of a completely different spirit. Estera Bader was enrolled in a diploma program at the University of World Trade. Only 2 days after the German troops marched into Austria, she left her apartment on Bergmanngasse in Vienna, located close to Sigmund Freud's practice and the premises that housed the Imperial Export Academy. She fled to Poland, and her further fate remains unknown. How can someone's fate be unknown? How is it possible that we don't know what happened to the people who suffered so much pain? And yet, there is so much we don't know. People have become numbers, and their stories have been lost. Braina Gerschatter was born in Vilnius in the 1920s and 1930s. Her parents visited many countries during their travels. Their daughter was a student at the University of World Trade when the so-called Anschluss forced the family to leave Vienna and return to Vilnius. Braina and her entire family were murdered and did not live to see the end of the war. Moses Jakob Vogel was born in Starunia, a village which is today part of Ukraine. He was the son of a merchant and only got to complete a single semester at the University of World Trade, the 1937-1938 winter semester. For many other students like him, this semester was their only one or their last one. Halina Kohn lost both of her parents at the age of 18 and struggled to make ends with the help of her half-sister. In 1937, she changed her typically Jewish name to Karen in an attempt to protect herself from the anti-Semitism she experienced. She is one of the very few Jewish students who were able to complete their studies at the university after the so-called Anschluss. She then moved to Warsaw and joined a socialist youth organization. She risked her life fighting in the resistance and, among other things, was involved in blowing up the Warsaw casino next to the Gestapo headquarters. Halina Karen is a resistance hero, but hardly anyone knows her name. Monuments and museums should be built in her honor, and streets should be named after her, but she has been forgotten by her country. Why is that remembering is so hard and forgetting apparently so easy? Today, the atrocities committed by the Nazis seem far away. People say in our country that we have learned our lesson from history, never again. But in reality, the crises of the present day, from the pandemic to the war, are fueling prejudice and anti-Semitic sentiments in the whole country. More than 1 in 3 Austrians believe in anti-Semitic myths. 36% think that Jewish people enjoy privileges today because they were persecuted during the time of National Socialism. 19% agree with the statement that the persecution of Jewish people was partly the Jews' own fault. Our country's culture of remembrance is not only lagging behind, no. It's at risk of grinding to a standstill. But we must remember, not only because it's our duty, because we owe it to the victims of National Socialism, no. We must remember because remembering is the only way to learn our lesson from history. Only if we don't look away from what happened in Austria during the times of Austro-fascism and National Socialism, we will be able to make sure history won't repeat itself. Only if we name the names, we can take responsibility. Only if we remember, we will be able to intervene. Only if we remember, we can make sure that it never happens again. So let us name the names. Unfortunately, we cannot go through all the biographies right now, but that's what the online memorial book is for. Let's tell these people's stories, and let's do things better than the generations before us. Let us say their names. Leopold Weiß, Josef Hillebrand, Walter Koch, Fritz Rubitschek, Karl Pollack, Theodor Abtecker, Meyer Billig, Gertrud Löwinger, Johann Porias, Felix Coela, Hans Bader, Zita Appel, Josef Feuerstein, Salma Blum, Moishe Bendet, Rosa Kleiner, Heinrich Kiewe, Hans-Karl Cessner-Spitzenberg, Estera Schmulewitsch, Auguste Löwy, Suse Löwy, Johann Rosenberg, Erich Kohn und Sigmund Pollack. Dankeschön. Thank you very much. I have now the honor of passing the floor to Dina Porat. She's Professor Emeritus of Modern Jewish History at Tel Aviv University and the Chief Historian of Yad Vashem. We are so pleased that you joined this evening here with us and that you will give now a very, very special keynote under the title Jews in Vienna, Accepted and Rejected, the Berta Zuckerkandl Salon as a Test Case. The stage is yours. You can applaud, yes.
Thank you all. Thank you for having invited me. Before I start, I would like to say that when the rector of Tel Aviv University heard I was coming here, we decided to offer the rectoring of this university a special gift. You're kindly invited to get it. And he sent you a short letter. A letter and a gift. If you would like to open, please.
Thank you. I take this one. Thank you very much.
Okay. So, thank you for having invited me, the rectorin. Thank you, the organizers, Bit and Martin. The topic, and the general topic here, is Jewish life in Vienna from the end of the 19th century until 1938. Now, having defined the topic, I would like to speak about 3 books that will help us understand, and according to this book, to speak about 3 subtopics. Okay? This we will do with the help of these 2 ladies. The lady on the right, this is a painting by Klimt. You all know. Perhaps you don't know this one especially. Her name was Amalie. She is cousin of the lady on the left, about whom we'll speak in a minute. And she was painted, and she was part of the Zuckerkandl family. Zuckerkandl. Okay? The lady on the left is Berta. Berta Zuckerkandl, as we'll hear in a minute, held a cultural salon in her home for many years, from 1897 to 1910, which is about 13 years, then First World War, and then again from 1917 for 20 more years until the Anschluss, as you say, the so-called Anschluss in 1938. So these are ladies of centrality in the cultural life of Vienna. Okay, next. Yeah. These are the 3 books I will be speaking about. One is Die Stadt ohne Juden, 1922, okay, the city without Jews. The second one is less known, Gregor von Razzori, and it is called in English, The Memoirs of an Anti-Semite. both of them Viennese. The third one, Ora Achimeir, an Israeli writer, researched and wrote the biography of Berta Zuckerkandl. She herself, she's married to an Achimeir, but she herself comes from the Zuckerkandl family. Her family originates in Vienna. And she wrote this book, it's in Hebrew by now only, in Berta's Salon. Now, a few numbers. The number of Jews in Austria in World War I, 250,000, including refugees, out of 6.8 million in Austria in general, and 24 in Vienna. Please look at the proportion. And the proportion again, 1934, 191 Jews, out of which 176 are in Vienna, out of 7.5 million in all Austria, and 2 million in Vienna, which means that the Jews in Vienna were less than tenths of the population, less than tenths. 1938, there were 185. In 1938, hundreds committed suicide following the Anschluss, both Jews and non-Jews. I have numbers for the Jews and non-Jews who committed suicide on that year. 126 left until September, until the war broke, and 2,000 more after. And they spread all over the world and reached some 90 countries. 65,000 were sent to ghettos and camps in Eastern Europe, including 50,000 who managed to escape to Western Europe but were caught there. Only 1,747 came back after the war to Vienna, and 1,000 survived in Vienna itself. Okay? Please take it off, because otherwise you will look at the numbers and you will not look at me. Okay? That's it. Now I have, following the books and the numbers, I have 3 points I would like to make. The first is proportion. Proportion. You looked at the number, and the question, how could it be that a minority that numbers less than a tenth of the population in the capital, in Vienna, was leading, or at least very central, to the cultural, artistic, scientific life of the city, in Vienna and around it. And here comes, because of this lack of proportion, here comes my dealing with the first book, which I mentioned. The first one is this, Eine Stadt ohne Juden, a city without Jews. I'm sure you heard about it. There was also a movie, which brings the lack of proportion to an absurd. What does this book? It's a fiction. It's an idea out of the imagination of the writer. It never happened. But in 1922, he says, there was a general decision in Vienna to expel all Jews. All Jews, because they are dominating, they are taking, they are everywhere, and out. So all Jews are expelled out of the city. And what happens to the city? The city becomes a village, just a poor village. No art, no culture, no elegance, no shops, and especially no economy. The city is actually ruined. It's a fiction. But it brings to an absurd this centrality of the Jews and the part that they played in the city, in, as we said, cultural, economic, artistic, etc. life. That was the first one, point proportion. The second one is two words. It's as if two societies lived one by the side of the other. And one was this bubble or circles of cultural life that the Jews were such a part in, and the other was outside these circles, and outside these circles, anti-Semitism flourished. And why did it? Well, why? That's a big question. That's an ancient question. It had its roots in the church, Catholic, etc. But in this special case we are speaking about, Franz Josef gave the Jews rights, civic rights. And then they started living their quarters, being involved, working with non-Jews, being in every profession. And then there was a reaction. Why such an involvement? Why everywhere? And then Karl Weger, who was a declared racist and anti-Semite, whom Kaiser Franz Josef detested, was elected to be the mayor of Vienna. Franz Josef refused to confirm the election. It was a formal step. First elections and then confirming. He refused once, he refused twice, he refused 3 times. There is a debate among researchers whether 4 or 5, but at least on the 4th or the 5th time he was elected, he had to confirm, because he was re-elected again and again, and because of his rising and mounting popularity. He was 13 years from 1897 to 1910, he was mayor of the city. Before being elected, he claimed that the Jews are ruining the city, robbing it, because they are robbing it and taking everything. When he was mayor, he was a bit more moderate, one should admit. But still, he had an impact on Hitler, who mentions him in Mein Kampf. Hitler lived some time under Karl Weger as a mayor, and he said in Mein Kampf that he saw in him a model to be imitated, a model to follow from the point of view of ideology, of rhetoric, of speaking to publics, and of inciting the middle and lower classes against upper educated ones, in which Jews were central. Karl Weger also had an impact on Herzl. Theodor Herzl, the person who envisioned the Jewish state and started political Zionism. He was 20. Herzl was born in 1860. He was 20 in 1880 when political anti-Semitism started, parties, pamphlets, calls to deprive civic rights, and he suffered from this anti-Semitism. And some years later, when Karl Weger was elected, Herzl wrote in his diary the following, that if this person was elected, this is a sign that, in his opinion, that the Austro-Hungarian Empire is not a stable one. It suffers of instability and will never really materialize the civic rights that Franz Josef once envisioned. And if this is so, this is a situation, he has to look for Herzl, has to look for other solutions, which he really did. I would say, if I may, taking a look back, that modern or political Zionism and modern political anti-Semitism were born more or less in the same years. in the second half of the 19th century, the 1880s, the 1890s, and they were like racing one side by one near the other. But unfortunately, anti-Semitism won the upper hand, and the state was born, the Jewish state was born after the Holocaust. Here comes the second book. The second book I showed you is less known. A person called Gregor von Razzori lived also much of his life in Vienna. And what's striking about his book is that he describes Jews and describes their as if qualities. These qualities never existed and such Jews never exist. What is anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism is the discrepancy between what Jews are and between what the anti-Semitic imagination attributes to them. And he has long, ugly descriptions of Jews that I certainly will not quote for you. And still, it's as if this coin has two sides. One is detesting these Jews, and the other one is admiring them for talents, sometimes for beauty, for achievements. And what is striking, one point is these two sides of the coin, and the other one is that for him, for this Gregory, at the time he was a prolific writer and very popular, for him anti-Semitism is natural. It's part of life. It's self-understood. You don't have to apologize. The sun rises and the Jews should be detested. It's natural for him. You read it, and your heart, as we say in Yiddish, zittert. Because, okay, if this is so, if it's natural, where are we going? Will it ever end? Third point. Third point is called betrayal. The hope of the Jews who were integrated, involved, contributing, etc., was that this enlightened side of Vienna, whom they knew, and the circles they were moving in, will stand with them and protect them and be with them when, in case something happens. But it didn't. It was Berta Zuckerkandl, you remember the lady on the left, who is a symbol of involvement and all of contribution. She led the most important cultural salon in the city for some dozens of years, as we said, until the war and then later. The crème de la crème of the personalities in Vienna had tea there. She served only tea. It's a bit difficult, but she served only tea. Who wasn't there? Freud, Arthur Schnitzler, Herzl, August Klimt, who painted her, you know, the lady in gold, of course, and her cousin, Amalie. Alma and Gustav Mahler, August Rodin. I tell you in a minute why August Rodin, who meets Klimt there. The philosopher Wittgenstein, young Johann Strauss, Franz Werfel, Egon Friedel, I can go on and on. But her sister, Berta's sister, Sophie, was married to Paul Clemenceau, brother of George Clemenceau, Prime Minister of France. And she puts up a salon, establishes a similar salon in Paris. And these two ladies are having the cultural life of Vienna and Paris come close. And this is how August Rodin is invited by her to meet Klimt. So there was mutual impact among these personalities. Berta is a known and important journalist. She's a known person. She's heard. Her opinion is important. She moves around the best and highest circles in politics and in culture. And when after World War I, Austria is devastated. I don't have to tell you, you know better than I do. Austria is devastated economically, first of all, up to the point of hunger. The empire is gone. Natural resources are taking. It's a country that lost the war. And not only that, there is a committee, a supporting committee, an American one, which decides mainly by the UK, Lloyd George, the United States, Woodrow Wilson, and George Clemenceau, not to support the losing countries, Austria included, only the ones who won and still need support. Listen to this. The foreign minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Austria, calls Berta and asks her to write to Clemenceau. He is her brother-in-law. Her sister is married to his brother. And they themselves, George Clemenceau and Berta, didn't exactly have an affair. When they met, he was 42, she was 19, Mele. But they had a very special and close relation. The correspondent survives and is here. So she writes. First, there is no answer. But then she decides to write a more emotional letter and manages to have someone who puts the letter on his desk where she knows that he keeps his private letters. And she says, George, I know you are breaking Austria to pieces in order to punish it. And I know this is a terrible injustice. If you go on refusing that France would supporting the countries who lost, Austria included, you will be responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of Austrian children whose health is already ruined after 4 years of deprivation. You love Vienna, but its situation, the Vienna that you loved for its grace and pleasantness, is tragic. And you cannot help destroy it completely. Therefore, you wrote to me, she writes to him, you wrote to me once, my life are yours. For you I live. And this gives me the right to ask you the grace of this supporting committee. You don't have to answer me. She knows he cannot answer directly. Just send a messenger who would knock on my door and I will know you agreed. And the next day, there was a messenger at the door. Clemenceau took off his refusal and Austria got the support. In other words, this lady saved Austria at the time. But when the Anschluss came, Austria did not save her. Cruelty begins after the Anschluss. It's not our topic for today, but it's hard and it's terrible and humiliation. All properties are taken and no one helps her. She asks around for a supporting shoulder and there is no one. A French friend helps her to escape to France, and then a brave admiral, French of a ship, takes some 350 Jews from France to Algiers. This is where she lives until she dies. Amalie, her cousin, ends in the Belgians' death camps. that's it. All in all, some 1,200 Jews committed suicide. The rest, as we saw, escaped or were taken to camps and to ghettos. Therefore, I call this third point betrayal, because this lady is the symbol of the betrayal of people who tried to see Austria as their home, who tried to contribute, who felt Austrian. And when they were refused, and when their hopes were slapped in the face, some committed suicide, as we said, many. It's the highest proportion. This rate of suicide is the highest proportion in Europe, and the rest, as we said, fled or were caught. And that was the end of the involvement of Jewish life. And I do end by commending this university under the leadership of the rectorin, who is doing what we are doing today, remembering, as Eva said, remembering the names, remembering what happened, and trying with this remembrance to go on. Thank you very much.
So we heard now a lot about the Jewish life in Vienna. I think a lot of new things for all of us, at least for me. And I thought a lot about what should this discussion at the end be about, what can we talk about. And I thought it would be important and I think also necessary to draw the ball also to the present day. Anti-Semitism is still a topic today, as we know. And before we start a discussion about it, I would like to introduce formally everybody again. Next to me is Dina Porat. Of course, you already know her. She's a professor emeritus and the chief historian. Next to her, I would like to introduce to you Wolfgang Mayrhofer. He's professor at the University of Economics, and he deals, among a lot of other things, with the initiative Anti-Semitism at Work. And at the end of this stage, you already know him as well, is Johannes Koll. He's senior scientist at the Institute of Economic and Social History and head of the university archives. Welcome you all on the stage. I would like to start this discussion with a current newspaper report from May. 2 people were charged in Austria for playing speeches by Adolf Hitler via the loudspeaker system in a train running from Bregenz to Vienna. I think a lot of us have heard the news. It was broadcasted in TV and newspapers. And I would like to start with you, Professor Mayrhofer, with the question, we hear this news. How would you say, how common is anti-Semitism in Austria right now?
Well, this is not a matter of what I think.
Yes.
Because in terms of anti-Semitism in general, there is good, reliable, hard data. I mean, the Austrian Parliament has recently published a few weeks ago a report on the current situation, and I think you have addressed it in your speeches. So it's very, very clear that this is not a phenomenon of the past. But what is puzzling for me is the yelling silence when it comes to anti-Semitism at the workspace, because we don't have comparable data, insight when it comes to the area of work.
You started now with it. Maybe you can explain it more detailed. What's anti-Semitism at work?
Well, these are all the anti-Semitic patterns of thinking, of acting, and of non-acting that are familiar to us, unfortunately familiar to us from the area of daily life, but transferred and emerging in the workspace. And very often this is very, very subtle. And if you would ask me how obvious, how blatant is anti-Semitic behavior at the workspace, a first glance would show, And this is the reaction you very often get. I recently talked to a friend of mine when I told him, well, we have this initiative. He said, yeah, but is there anything special about that in terms of other minority groups? Is it worth it, kind of looking at this specific group? And I found that very interesting. I mean, you have about 1,000, if I got their figures from the ministry correct, transgender persons in Austria. And if you would say, and there are about 10,000, 15,000 Jews, depending on how you count, nobody would dare to say loud, you're dealing with transgender persons, are they worth it? Nobody would do that officially. But a lot of people say, is this worth it? And that's for me a kind of sign that we have to dig deeper and that we have to take a closer look. Because whenever there is a blank, social scientists like myself get very, very interested and very, very alert.
I will ask you a lot more about international comparison in anti-Semitism. Sorry?
I'd like to react.
Yes,
to that
you are
first.
you are all very welcome to react. Please.
Yeah,
just
before we
yes.
go in, it's okay. It's heard.
You just talk.
Yes.
They
Yeah?
kind of
Yes.
push you up. Yeah.
Okay. Before we go internationally, I'd like to put in, if I may, a positive point. Okay, if you allow. And this is the following. In 218, we had here in Vienna, there's a trio of professors from Tel Aviv, New York, and Vienna. We had a huge conference with a participation of 150 researchers who gave lectures. I would say the high echelons of the country came to greet and to listen. Afterwards, we collected and published a catalogue of means to fight anti-Semitism. And at that year, Austria was president of the EU. Second half, it's always half a year. Second half of 2018. And the catalogue was printed in hundreds of copies and given to all members of the EU. Okay? Austria was also the first country to have a strategic plan to fight anti-Semitism. You can say it doesn't work, but it does in a point. Austria was the first country to have a strategic plan. Only 2 weeks ago, the United States, President Biden, has a strategic plan. But Austria was first in 2021 with budgets, with a minister in charge. And that's a team in Tel Aviv University that follows anti-Semitism, monitors anti-Semitism worldwide for some 30 years. And from 2021, after the strategic plan was published, numbers in Austria decreased in 2022. They decreased from 526 something to 380 something. On the other hand, violence went up, and on the other hand, opinions. The opinions that you both quoted, it's not cases, but it's opinions worsened. So there are efforts. You cannot say that Austria is doing nothing. Okay, there are efforts and there are some results.
Before we come to Professor Koll, because he has problems with his voices, so we give you another little break. I want to ask you, you wrote an article with the title, "What Makes an Anti-Semite?" And that's a question...
Oh, really?
Yeah, you did.
Okay.
And that's a question I think that's important also to ask, because now we had, like, for example, during the pandemic, you know, on demonstrations, we had yellow stars again. We had people who said they are the new Jews, although they're no Jews. What would you say if I ask you what makes an anti-Semite?
Okay. I think that if I have to give a concise answer, I would say that an anti-Semite is a person who has a certain mindset, with which he lives and which dictates his steps. And according to this mindset, Jews are responsible to many, or most even, many of the crises, the illnesses, the breakdowns, etc., the economic problems, etc. These are conspiracy theory believers. And I would say that believing in these conspiracies, the Jews are able. We're not only a minority in Vienna, we're a minority in the world. We are now 14 million and a bit more. We didn't recover from the Holocaust. The numbers are not there what they were before the Holocaust. But still, the anti-Semitic imagination and the mindset attributes, needs a symbol, needs someone to blame, and deeply believes that in these conspiracy theories.
We heard before a lot about all your research, Johannes Koll. I would like to ask you now, or today we celebrate 125 years of WU. Why is it so important to look back in the past, and why is it so important to do the research you do, for example?
I mean, in the course of 125 years, there have been many tendencies, many developments, contradictory developments, but we should not lose out of sight that there also were, let's say, some problematic developments. And in some historical periods, these problematic tendencies became dominant, to put it like that. Of course, I'm talking again about the Nazi period, but of course, the Nazi period did not come from nothing. There was a long history of anti-Semitism, of greater German nationalism that were intertwined, so to speak, before that period. And I'm glad that Dina Porat widened our perspective here, since the fin de siècle, anti-Semitism was some kind of dominant way of thinking within the society. And also in this university, which we perceive of as some kind of working place, a very specific working place, where later victims, but also perpetrators, followers of National Socialism came together, where they were together. So this is a specific working place. Here you also found these tendencies before the Nazis seized power also in Austria. But anti-Semitism also had a tradition after 1945. Let's think, for example, about Taras Borodajkevich. Those who are familiar with contemporary history of Austria certainly know this name. He had been a National Socialist in the 1930s and 40s, though always on the border between Catholicism and National Socialism. But notwithstanding his Nazi past, he became bestowed with a professorate in 1955 at this university. And he did not stop talking in, let's say, the old manner on certain topics, especially on Jews. He made remarks that were not in accordance with the post-war order, so to speak. So there are traditions which cannot be limited to the 7 years from 1938 to 1945, and it's important to realize that also such aspects do belong to the history of an institution like WU, and I would wish that also other universities would do the comparable projects. Some do, some others might do more efforts in this respect.
I would like to ask you all three a question, because I think it makes sense, and whoever wants to answer can answer. Because I ask myself, how does science help in all this fight against anti-Semitism? Is science maybe the way, like you said at the beginning, I don't think there is data, you know? Maybe, I don't know who wants to answer, is science maybe the way, you know, to get rid of anti-Semitism?
Just to briefly correct, I hope I said, I didn't say I don't think, but hopefully I said it's not a matter of thought only. Yeah? Yes. Okay, but I try to think at least. I don't think that science is the answer, but I think science is part of the answer, because science can help to a certain extent to enable us in our conversation, to enable us in our views that we have, to take them out of the purely individual, I think, I have an opinion, I assume realm, and put it on a more stable basis. This is by no means a guarantee. And when we look, you mentioned COVID before, and you can see what happened there on a number of fronts. So kind of hard evidence, good theorizing, convincing arguments, in the end not necessarily win, but without a kind of good theoretical and empirical base, our conversations become kind of exchange of views, and that's not enough. That's not enough, and in our area that we have, I think the historical work, and I'm a kind of humble business administration person, without the historical work that we have, without other kind of disciplines contributing to this topic, I think our conversations become too poor and too one-sided. So that's, I think, as I said, is part of the answer, but not the whole answer.
Mm-hmm. Please contribute.
Yeah. I would say the following. Science or universities, what we do in universities, not necessarily reach wide publics and not necessarily reach youngsters who are the next generation whom we hope will, or we do hang pin our hopes on them, that they would learn and be different. I think that education, based on what is researched and known by educators who were trained in university, etc., I think that perhaps a way not to get rid of anti-Semitism, that's a utopia that will not materialize. Perhaps we can hope to lower it, to make it less violent, but it is there. It is a useful symbol. It is an opinion shared by millions. We will not get rid of it. But what I'm hoping is that perhaps the rampant ignorance that exists among youngsters can be a bit overcome by making them one known to another. And what do I mean? We had in Yad Vashem a delegation from the municipality of Berlin. Bosses. In Berlin, you have classes with Jews, Muslim, and Christians, high school, elementary school, And the children are basically busy hitting one another. And the teachers are at loss. And so we suggested to them, I really, perhaps we can believe in this way a bit, suggested to them a program, 2 of studies. Okay, Muslim children will study about Judaism, about which they know nothing. They will be invited to Jewish homes, to Jewish holidays, to a synagogue. Jewish children will read a bit of the Quran and go to see what is Ramadan. Christian children, you know, I gave an assignment to an MA student of mine. What is the role of Jesus in high school textbooks in Israel? And it can be summed in 2 words. Okay? There is no rule. Jewish children should know something about Christianity. And vice versa. They don't know each other, and generations are growing with rampant ignorance about one another. Perhaps instead of teaching anti-Semitism, what is teaching anti-Semitism? Is bringing back, is showing to the next generations all the ugly faces of anti-Semitism. Let's go positive. Let's try to introduce the richest of cultures and traditions to one another.
I think that's a very beautiful thought, also for Vienna, for the future of Vienna and schools. Johannes, Koll, would you like to say something on the matter of science in the fight against, I think, discrimination against anybody?
Yes, trying to give an answer on the question after Dina Porat has been talking is quite difficult. There has been said so many interesting things. Perhaps on a more general level, I would say that one might be skeptical if history and historiography are really able, let's say, to indicate in which direction society ought to go. Perhaps that would be too big a burden to a science like historiography. But at any event, we can indicate in which direction we should not move, because obviously some mechanisms, some ways have proven to be negative for humanity, So this is not much if we just have to confine our science, the historical sciences, to saying where we will not want to go to. But I would like to add that many initiatives in the cultural field, and of course research projects like the ones I have presented to you here, help us to get a better knowledge about the past, but possibly also about the present. So if we do a research, we get another picture of the university. When I started the commemorative project in 2012, we simply did not know how many people, in fact, were affected by the Nazi regime. And in the meantime, the commemorative book on the internet is filled with more than 150 persons with very divergent fates. Within 10 years, we have learned very, very much about the history which had not been known before, and I think that changes something. And this is important, and in this respect, I hope that science can help us to understand our own society.
Thank you. Keyword knowledge. We talked before at the coffee shop about young people, about blind spaces in politics, history, etc. I also did some research for this moderation, and I found one survey where not only young people, people in general, were asked from where Adolf Hitler was, and not such a small number said he was German. For me, this was a good example about how important it is to learn about history, because if you think he was German, of course you can make distance in responsibility again, like I said in my speech, because then it's like, okay, it was Germany's problem and Austria was the first victim. I mean, this is one of these myths. how would you say, can you change something for the next generations in education, in making history cool again? What are the ways? Do you have ideas?
I think that perhaps one way could be with undermining, limiting our hopes, using the social media. Okay, they are all walking around, going down the street without paying attention to anything but to this. Using the social media in order to make themes, to bring themes closer to young generations. I have grandchildren. They think I was born in King David's days. That's for sure. These are generations, new generations, that we have to understand in a different way than we were brought up, than we think, and to try to make ourselves more useful in introducing materials through the media, the social media. I'll give an example. A certain Israeli took a diary of a young girl in Hungary, the diary of Eva, and put it with all the costumes and the furniture of the time during the Holocaust on Instagram. And there was an outcry, Gewalt, Instagram, this is cheapening the Holocaust, what kind of a... No, it's not cheapening. It depends on... A Holocaust denier writes a book. A book is okay, no? The main thing is the content. If the content is okay, and you convey it in today's style, short, they will not read a lot. They will not watch a lot. Short, to the point, interesting. It's a lot of work. Yeah, it's changing all your mindset. We have to come closer to them. And I'm not a stone. I was not born in King David's days. But this is definitely how they look at us.
Wolfgang Mayrhofer, yes, thank you.
And to add to what Dina said, I think the medium is one thing, but I'm fully convinced from other areas that unless the content matters to them personally and solves something, is an answer to something that each and every one of us carries around, you can have whatever media you want. You see, as you said it before, goes in here and goes out there.
Sure.
So therefore, I think the maybe even deeper issue is to clarify that phenomena like anti-Semitism, whether it is in the broader society or at the workplace, in the nucleus, kind of tells us something about the pulse, the kind of temperature of a society. And if the link can be made between what happens to a seemingly kind of negligible minority is something of a weak signal, of an early herald, what might happen to us broader in society and to other groups, if we are able to convey something like that, how does it matter to their or to all of our lives? Then I think we are, as we would say, in business.
Thank you. I would have one last question for you. I think we're all interested in how will the research go on. Is there more research planned for the future? Are there more names coming, or are there more projects coming? Is there anything you can tell us? How will, I'm sure the WU will continue dealing with the past. Maybe you can enlighten us a bit how you will do the research on it.
Yes, there is definitely still a lot to do. The two research projects which are presented to you will go on. It's a work in progress, I would say. Up to now, with regard to the honorary degrees, we just checked the group of the honorary doctors, but we have plenty of honorary senators, plenty of honorary burghers, plenty of bearers of the badge of honor, and so on and so on. So there are huge groups of persons that have to be screened in the future. And also with regard to the commemorative project, which is concentrated on the victims of the National Socialist persecution, there is much work to do. In some cases, here and there, I'm informed from descendants of the respective persons. I get additional information from descendants, which has to be worked in the yet existing entries in the commemorative book. But there are also other persons which here and there I identify, for example, when browsing through the records of the Austrian State Archive or other archives, and also here in our own archives. From time to time, I discover new names, and when I start to figure out if these respective persons have been victims of National Socialist persecution, I have to continue the work. So this is really work in progress, and it does not stop immediately. I fear that in the next years I will have to do a lot of work, and perhaps we will see again for another ceremony when we have to add new names to the monument in a few years.
Thank you so much for enlightening us. Unfortunately, we have a tough timetable, which I already overstood a bit. Thank you so much for taking the time for the discussion. Thank you all so much for listening. And at the end, we welcome the rector again on the stage for some goodbye words. Thank you so much for listening and doing the discussion. Should we go? Should we stay? Okay.
Yeah. Again, as rector of this university, it is my honor to say a few closing words. Emotionally, this has been one of the most difficult evenings that I got to partake in as a rector of this university. I'm sure many of you will feel the same way, so I will stick to the script and make it short. There are 3 things that I want to say. First of all, I would like to thank all of you for coming and participating in today's special event. I would like to thank everyone who has involved in the preparation, guests, friends, colleagues, both in the audience and of course on the panel, as well as my team at this university working a lot for this evening. Thank you very much. Second, I would like to announce that the Rectorate of WU has decided to support the continuance of research on anti-Semitism in economics and business, because we do believe in the necessity of doing research. What we said and heard and learned tonight must not stop here. Therefore, a seed funding of 50,000 euros will be provided by the WU Foundation and will, among basic research, be used to start an international research network on anti-Semitism in economics and business. And I thank to my initiative faculty group for starting up these research topics. Thank you so much. And third, I would like to ask all of you for your continued support of this and all other institutions, events, initiatives, and people that come together and try to do better, that are seeking to face and carry that responsibility and pass our knowledge and remembrance on the future generations. WU is open to inclusion. Thank you very much. And I would like to invite you to join us for a small reception. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of stuff to be discussed. Thank you very much for coming.